Hello, I wanted to do another video for this episode because there's so much to cover and I didn't want it to get bogged down in the details. Like at any point we could pivot and cover a whole new area of behavior, and here's just a small example of how detailed it can get with just a base technique of body language interpretation. I'm Michael Williams of Popcorn. First of all, I get an F- for acting, and throughout these scenes it's going to be the same score. That's one issue with doing body language interpretation of a simulation such as a movie. The script and its goals are brought under scrutiny and either the acting becomes visible or the skewed goals of the play are visible. Unless it's really top-notch acting like Daniel Day-Lewis or Joe Pistone, it's going to be interpreted as acting rather than a real event. I'm looking to my left because I'm pretending to be preoccupied, and I blow that gesture because my eyes are slightly open more than the norm and my cheekbones are a little high. Also, I have a slight smile, a common problem with novices being in front of a camera because, of course, the main goal of virtually everyone at virtually every moment of communication is the acquisition of positive reinforcement. Being in front of a camera amplifies this effect, so people in front of a camera sometimes can't help but smile. They're in essence sharing a resource of information with other species members, and the number is far greater than if I were in a conversation with a small room full of people. It's the soapbox effect. Whether it's good or bad, the person speaking is broadcasting himself to gain positive reinforcement and then gain an increase in status among peers. The smile is also partly from embarrassment because a smile or an uneasy laugh is used to play up a possible failed attempt at something. It's as if I'm saying, don't read too much into this attempt, don't raise my status from this because I'm not worthy. I did attempt to motivate myself by thinking I'm doing something on the computer. I think I'll have some popcorn, I'll tell a nearby person so they'll know. But I didn't quite brainwash myself enough. Besides all that, if you can tune out all the bad acting in these, we'll attempt to isolate all the problems being solved with the communication. I'm Michael Williams of Popcorn. The phrase as a whole can be measured for the level of tones used. It's slightly above the societal norm for the basic sharing of a resource. It adds a small level of excitement that's indicative of a slightly raised perception that the speaker will gain some positive reinforcement. I'm Michael Williams of Popcorn. If it were a lower collection of tones, then this would show a lesser expectation of positive reinforcement. If it were a higher collection of tones, then there would be greater expectation of positive reinforcement. This overall tone measurement is important to defining what's happening. The first syllable is drawn out, suggesting that the speaker is in the middle of solving some problem while also engaging in the problem being solved with the communication. He's solving that conversational problem of trying to communicate the making of popcorn as well as solving the problem of whatever he's doing on the computer. That's what I was trying to act out there. The function, the conversational topic, the motive, is revealed by the highest tone. In this case, the highest tone falls on I'm. And the emphasis is on the function I'm doing something. Then the microwaving of popcorn is the equated function that I'm doing. The tones drop from the beginning until a slight rise on pop, then the lowest tone is reached on the end. The slight rise in the end is partly from the kind of word popcorn is, that I believe it lends itself to being accented on the front syllable. Also, it's the natural rhythm to rise slightly before the ending low tone, which the ending tone is the concluding low tone. It's the concluding of all the ideas of the phrase. It gives a bit of a melody to the phrase, and that's a user-friendly feature of human conversation. It doesn't have much of a meaning beyond that, rather than having that melodic pattern to it. I don't believe, unless someone knows otherwise. In a nutshell, that's the definition of what's happening with this communication. Now, let's imagine you just turned on a universal artificial intelligence. It comes up to speed and it notices this person making this statement. Just like any human observer, it will begin to build a profile of this subject. It will notice that this appears to be a social media broadcast of some kind where the subject is projecting information to other species members to solve mutual problems. The AI will understand that this subject, this person, this human, is attempting to solve a positive reinforcement problem and by extension, a status problem. And it will know that there are apparent unknown goals in the larger video. It will begin to catalog all the same definitions we just looked at with an even greater precision, because it will begin systematically comparing this situation to thousands of similar humans in similar situations. It will isolate all the subordinate motives around the phrase, connect those motives to the larger goals, and trace those larger goals all the way back to the primary life form problems of consumption, reproduction, and peripheral. The raised cheek is child's play to the AI because it has a highly advanced knowledge of all the individual elements found in human communication. Any and all possible motives of the larger conversation, in this case a larger video, will be child's play to the AI. This is why I'm going through all these attempts to convince you that body language interpretation can be performed in exacting terms. If body language interpretation can be done consistently, element by element, millisecond by millisecond, it's only a hop, skip, and a jump to build a software program that can track human actions one by one, isolate problems being solved one by one, and based upon its protocol. This universal software program can assist its human subjects in solving their problems. I'm Mike Williamson. Popcorn? This is a basic question with a high tone on the end. Conversational topics almost always follow the format of a high tone or abrupt tone change to mark the beginning of a topic, and a low tone concludes a topic or a subtopic. In the case of a question, a speaker is passing the topic to a second speaker who is expected to provide that low tone in their response. So he reaches a high tone here, and then a low tone is expected to be given by the second speaker. Or at least there's some sort of understanding there. I'm Michael Williamson. Popcorn? This is a question also, but now the word I'm also has a high tone before it slowly creeps up again at the end of the phrase. Because the tone is higher than normal and because it's two-toned, it's recognizable as a question as, I'm the one who's supposed to be making the popcorn, I'm the one who's supposed to do it. I'm Mike Williamson. Popcorn. Here the subject has a nearly continual descent in tones, and the lower tone range of the whole phrase denotes that this making of popcorn is possibly a less preferable task, that there are possibly better things to eat or do. The head tilt and the snap back at the beginning is a way to emphasize the task he's speaking of. The movement of the head to the left, it's like the simulation of getting up and having to walk over and do something, and I don't know if I want to do it. I'm kind of acting that way. And then at the same time, the pinched eyebrow on the return signifies a distaste in the task. I'm Mike Williamson. Popcorn. The drawn-out tones across I'm and microwaving and the squinting brow and the side-to-side head movement suggest that the subject isn't sure about undergoing a task. It could be that a task that he's undergoing on the computer screen that I'm pretending to be reading, and he's projecting that onto the view of the statement of the popcorn. But there are clearly other circumstances other than just the making of some popcorn. A head nodding yes is fairly universal across humans, but it doesn't happen for other species. An affirmative nod, I believe, has its roots in gesturing yes. You can put that item down, the gift or something that I'm accepting. I'll accept that. It's okay, and we'll place this here. And it's like movement to a low tone at the conclusion of a topic or an idea. And if you're shaking your head no, that means a negative. We're still working on it. We're in the middle tones, and we haven't quite concluded this. And while yes means figuratively, we're coming up on our best options here. I think we're on to something. We're getting into high tones, and it's a positive. And we can elaborate on it a little bit more, and then we can come to a safe low tone. I'm microwaving some popcorn. The drawn-out high tone on the function of the sentence suggests that the speaker is trying to convince the second subject of a particular argument of the making of the popcorn. The speaker believes the second subject is expecting a different course of action, and he's begging the question because he disagrees with their point of view. I'm microwaving some popcorn. The high tone on some suggests that the quantity of popcorn is possibly not sufficient, that the question of quantity is a proposed subtopic of the main topic of making popcorn. This next example is tough as a ball. If I get this, it should be an Academy Award. Mike Williamson. Popcorn. Too much of a low tone on the end there. Mike Williamson. Popcorn. Mike Williamson. Popcorn. That's probably about as good as it gets. What I was trying to do is say the phrase without any tone variation. You kind of need some tone variation no matter what, because a low tone is needed at the end to conclude a thought or an idea. I also tried to say it in the most medium of tones, because if it's too low, it begins to show a negative emotion, and if it's too high, it shows a positive emotion of brandishing a resource, either to share or just to gain the status of that. But if you remove all of that, all the possible gestures and tone signatures that reference internal thoughts or things happening in the larger conversation, the speaker would be solving the base problem of consuming, that ancient life form problem we learned to solve 4 billion years ago. And all the other reference problems and all the other clips are all the things that we learned after the Cambrian explosion. So as you see, we could spend hours studying the smallest of human behaviors, and I'm trying to make these videos more manageable. I originally wanted to cover art, music in a more detailed way, and also the avoidance of mortal events, which that's another interesting concept there. It really permeates how we think. We build our schedule around all the different ways that we want to avoid lethal events and avoid getting injured. And then you go into a whole area of stress reduction. So you begin building your larger schedule out of that. And then you achieve a comfort zone. But there's a lot going on there. I wanted to cover a lot more of that. But I settled on sentience, and we'll return to those topics in the future. I settled on sentience, but there were a few things that I glossed over. And for one, for clarity, in the video, I mentioned that a new behavior emerges and is connected to a specific gene sequence. First, it's not so much the actual parts of the DNA molecule that change, but more the parts of the DNA molecule and possibly a change in one of the tens of thousands of protein molecules that make up the cell. That's part of the difficulty of connecting genes with traits. And what I really mean, roughly, when speaking of a new behavior is a new behavior is made up of hundreds of smaller behaviors, and each one of those incremental behaviors are connected to a new specific DNA sequence or combination DNA sequence plus other newly modifying proteins. Now, as noted, life forms move from a subjective to an objective state, from an autopilot mode to more of a sentient mode. One example given in the first video is when an animal stops and starts as it moves. The early invertebrates, I believe, were likely the first to develop this behavior. After that, it likely came and went with later species because life probably switched back and forth from crawling to swimming. Then when life moved on land, it re-emerged with the new land-based predator-prey relationships. But for the most part, for smaller species, I believe it remains a purely subjective behavior. They don't know that they're doing it to save themselves from danger. They simply do it at the direction of their genetic coding. They don't have that larger collection of contextual information that tells them that they're making themselves less visible to predators. A more developed animal, such as a reptile or a mouse, after passing through a juvenile stage, would be able to notice that nuance, but smaller animals are only doing it for the same base, arbitrary, peripheral action simply because their genes tell them to do it. Another basic example of an animal being subjective would be a hermit crab collecting broken shells to fasten to the top of its main shell. This is another arbitrary behavior that undoubtedly happened because the crabs that didn't have this gene failed in the environment at a higher rate. It possibly began with one species member having the odd propensity to walk out of a sheltered area with an extra shell. When having to close up, it became slightly more camouflaged because it has another shell sitting next to it, so it wins the odds of staying alive. Then it slowly started using saliva to connect these shells to its back, and the peripheral behavior modified little by little by little, step by step by step. I could be wrong, but I believe this is a mostly subjective behavior because it's quite different than the earlier task where it learned to climb into its main shell. There's probably a bit of a danger with that. There's a bit of a fear, but it's more of just the act of decorating its shell, which can be very peripheral and arbitrary. Another example would be when a cat climbs into a paper bag. If you observe a kitten doing this behavior, you can see that it's very innate, that they have a strong curiosity and interest with jumping into an enclosed space. It spurs positive emotion. Then later, when they notice a small toy rolling in front of the bag, they realize it's an ambush position and they gain more positive emotion, reinforcing the original action. And at another moment, when a dog walks by, they notice that it acts as a shelter from predators. The beginning of this peripheral behavior sheltering probably appeared shortly after the Cambrian explosion, when the basic propensity of lingering in a shaded area began. Now juvenile cats have an added mystique and interest with enclosed spaces, and when they mature, they begin to notice the more objective side of the behavior. Another good example of the movement from subjective to objective is the fear of heights. Consider the first reptiles to climb onto higher slopes. At first, believe it or not, they would have walked off the sheer cliffs simply because they didn't have the ability to understand falling. And I'm speaking of sheer cliffs. They probably understand the tumbling off of rocks a little bit. They probably had scrapes and bruises from that, and they have a set of behaviors to counter that. But they don't understand the sheer edge because it's very foreign to them, the ground being far away. They don't know not to walk in that direction. But over several generations, they started staying on the path because that gene coding came into place. This created a new peripheral arbitrary behavior where they have no idea why they like to avoid the edge. Then over many more generations, because they start to notice the violence of the event, the slipping and falling, the near misses, they develop a negative emotion of fear to deal with it. And bonus fact, the modern species that have this more sentient behavior fall into two camps. Some animals like mountain goats and rams pass through this subjective period where they innately stay on the path before they fully learn to fear it during adulthood. But humans, on the other hand, have little to no subjective period up until that moment when a parent warns them to have a fear of heights. A toddler wouldn't know to stay on a path until they've received that networked information. And there's yet another twist. And I'm not sure about this, but once a parent starts to teach their child that a fall is dangerous, this summons an innate view that heights are scary. The gene is in essence awakened by this networked information. There is a chance that the concept of danger is simply being associated with the stimulus of heights, but it could be like a parent networking that germs are bad and the child thinks, oh, that's one of those danger items, I'll avoid spreading germs or getting germs. But I do believe it to be quite an awakened gene, because there's a bit of a vertigo that happens that doesn't happen with young children. Now, while we're talking of humans doing things backwards compared to most animals, here's an example of a juvenile doing something the right way, and this consequently corrects all the things that they do the wrong way. Let's say that a mother is with a toddler in the living room. She's folding clothes and the toddler is playing with blocks. The mother moves into the laundry room where she changes another batch of clothes. A little while later, her son crawls into the laundry room. The juvenile is driven by a genetic direction to linger next to his mother, and this is no different than two fish in a school of fish lingering next to each other. This is a subjective phase of the more advanced mammalian social bonding behavior that he's about to get into. Then later, the child starts to view mom as the person who provides food and toys and goodies, and he starts to see the objective side of, oh, this is mom, I have to stick next to her. There's benefits with hanging out next to this person. And that's just one example of the subjective human behavior where a juvenile goes from a period where they have no understanding of this certain particular behavior that they're doing, and then they arrive at a point where they objectively look back and they say, oh, that's why we need to do this way. And there are many human behaviors that are very autopilot, and we can see those in conversation, like viewpoint that you might get into. And sometimes you won't even know. You keep buying this shirt and it goes on forever, and I don't know why I like it, but that's why I like that shirt. And you never achieve that objective viewpoint because just by chance you didn't happen to notice that. Other subjective behaviors could be found in the rivalries of siblings and peers and husbands and wives. And I'm not so much speaking of the bigger disputed issues, but I mean the small mannerisms such as eating the last piece of cake in a subconscious way and then saying, oh, I did that. It's often a small mannerism triggered by a base genetic behavior. Even if someone were to notice their own behavior and move to change their ways, they could easily slip because we're hot-wired to be a bit competitive. And of course, it's a balancing act between supporting the social structure by being fair and reasonable to peers and also gaining resources at the possible expense of peers. When you try to gain status or you try to gain resources, it's kind of almost as its nature taking away from somebody else. So you have to try to do that in a fair way. At least there's some fair ways, some fair avenues of doing that. Mimicry is another distinct behavioral trick that has its own genetic marker. It's distinct from other behaviors. I would assume that the first genetic marker of this probably appeared slowly through the Cretaceous period, and I'm assuming this because this was a time that several species of dinosaurs seemed to have clan and herding behavior. They had family units where family members lingered next to each other long enough, they might start to develop this behavior. Or it could have happened earlier, but that's just the assumption there. I don't think it happened much later than that. Then when mammals appeared, it modified many times over, and by the time primates arrived, it was essential to their development. Primates watch each other continuously, and if a member goes through a large series of reasoning steps, another would commit this to memory and also repeat the same steps. This likely boosted the ability of a species to pass through many more stacked procedural steps. The more they could observe, remember, and repeat, the better. Now we have humans who can play chess and calculate 10 moves ahead. I'm suggesting this is a singular behavior with its own genetic coding because it's the copying of an observed reasoning step rather than the originating of a reasoning step. It's not so much the putting a square block in a square hole, but seeing someone else do that task and then repeating it. Another peripheral behavior is the avoidance of the cliche. And another name for this is dishabituation, or in other words, a subject seeks to avoid the repeated stimulus and they choose something new. An example of this is when you bring a new box home and you set it in the living room, and the dogs come out from another room, and first they go through a greeting mode where they greet another clan member, and then they return to the box and start sniffing and walking around it. They have an interest in it. Life forms look for some changing stimulus, something that breaks up this pattern, and this, like mimicry, has its own genetic marker. Now, I wanted to look at a discrete state again, and I referenced these items we focused on as leading edge thoughts, and I wanted to explain a little more. And first of all, a discrete state is meant to be exactly that. We're looking at a single slice of time with a collection of every single function the life form is doing, and the list is, of course, much larger than this. The leading edge thoughts, those point decisions which guide a subject through a schedule, would be our main focus, but a discrete state covers all the problems across many layers of threads. Below the main actions of the nervous system are the mostly involuntary thoughts, a fleeting image or a melody of a song or the chatter of incoherent voices. This would be a secondary layer of threads. Then another layer of involuntary functions cover all the physiological systems below, the beating of a heart, the breathing, and the functions of a cell. And a note with foreground thoughts, it is possible to have two or more main threads going at the same time. For example, if you're patting your head and rubbing your stomach, that's a way of having two threads at once. A musician who sings and plays the guitar has two threads going at once, at the very minimum. There are other players, and they often keep track of what they're doing at the same time. And actors pretty much need a minimum of two threads of thought going because they're at least thinking for two people at the same time, themselves and the character that they play, not to mention the lines of the other characters and keeping track of time. And a professional chef also must have good situational awareness where they're cooking several pots at one time and they're keeping track of everything and making sure that nothing burns. The secondary layer of threads, those background thoughts that pop in and out of your head, can be understood with a fun experiment. This gets into an episode I like to do on getting a good night's sleep, and there are a lot of tricks for getting a good night's sleep, and basically you want to try to do all of them. Try not to have food in your stomach, cut out screen time, and lower the brightness, and many more. But this one exercise is something that can help you get the hang of the whole process. If you have a day off where you have nothing to do, no chores, nowhere to be, inform your family that in the morning that you're going to be off limits so you can try to sleep in the best you can. When you wake up, of course, you'll likely wake up needing to go to the bathroom, so as you're heading to the bathroom, you have to try not to think. You have to just not let any thought pop in your head. Try not to open your eyes. Just slowly get to the bathroom, take care of your business, wash your hands. Don't think of anything, just continue. Don't let your mind start racing because then you'll get into a real excited mode with the first thread of thoughts where you're starting to think of all the different things that you have appointed in the day. And I don't necessarily mean business or even going to work. It could mean thinking about something a free time activity that you want to do. If you're trying to sleep in, try not to think about anything. And then when thoughts pop into your head, you have to break them up. Try to break them up the best you can and just think complete nonsense. Like, I'm gonna play on the elephant, and if I read the book, I'm gonna fly in the plane to eat some stew, and then just continually roll through like complete nonsense and just don't make any sense with it. And then if you're lucky, you'll start to drift off into unconsciousness. You'll pass through that second layer where you're starting to hear the incoherent voices and images, you can't control them, you start to lose track of everything, and then you go unconscious. So that's one way of thinking about that secondary layer of thought. It's those very incongruent things that go on in the background of your mind, and if you mimic this kind of involuntary thought, these second layers, and break it up as much as possible, that'll help you drift into an unconscious state. And then you do the same thing as you're going to bed. You try to do that, of course, when you're going to bed too. Just don't think about anything. If anything, think about the comfortableness of the bed, and just like don't break into any kind of thought, and don't get excited for anything, because then that'll get you back on track of thinking of something. And my unfortunate problem, I'm often thinking of things I want to do while you're trying to sleep, because that's the one time it's like I work all day and then you go to bed and it's my free time and I get to sleep. I don't get to think or do anything. But That's a small example of passing through threads of thought. And as noted, we roll through these thoughts as per the rules of life. We have a schedule that always brings us back to the thinking of consuming and reproducing and solving peripheral problems. And let's say you're driving a car, you're daydreaming, and this is another kind of an exercise in it, and you're thinking, I need to call the daughter about getting the form for school. I hope the store is stocking the coffee I bought before. While I'm over that way, I'll stop at the hardware for posts to fix the fence. These first three thoughts show that the subject is attending their scheduled items. Getting the form is a school-related task, an educational task of some kind for their offspring. If the parent performs this task, he'll be furthering his daughter's success in life, and ergo, he would be solving a reproduction problem. Again, child-rearing problems are reproduction problems because the subject hasn't successfully reproduced until their offspring achieve a maturity. He's then thinking ahead to the positives and negatives of buying a consumable. And then he's thinking of fixing the fence, which solves the peripheral problem of maintaining a shelter. And that furthers the family unit to solve its future consumption, reproduction, and peripheral problems, respectively. Those are the foreground thoughts. Also, he has a second thread of thoughts where he's making small adjustments to the steering wheel as he drives. Once someone has passed through the learning stage with driving, they no longer have to attend this as a first thread task. Wait, do I have my wallet and my permit form? This shows the due diligence with the passing through the future scheduled items and thinking of things that might cause a problem. Of course, the subject missed a more appropriate timing for this thought. Wondering if the neighbor wants to get rid of that old trailer. Nose keeps itching. Here's an example of a lower thread partly rising to first thread status. We always answer to our basic physiological needs, and whenever needed, our primordial punch card system takes over our thought process. Dog in the TV show, hilarious. This one's tricky. Why in the world would someone recall a humorous event? It doesn't solve any consumption problem. It doesn't solve a reproduction problem. It's mostly a useless line of thought. However, the reason we think of such abstract peripheral thoughts is because we're built to recall something or accomplish something or read some interesting fact or have a barbecue or fly to an island getaway or virtually any other task because we want to tell someone what we've learned and what we've done and gain positive reinforcement. It's the end result of all thinking. The human mind was built from our movement towards positive reinforcement as a child. We literally learned the human language from positive reinforcement. We learned the reasoning steps of life through positive reinforcement. And this subject, although he's an adult, is thinking this memory because he's built to repeat such memories and gain a positive effect during communication. And you might say, wait a second, this is a solitary thought. He may never mention this to anyone. Yes, but positive reinforcement is still achieved right here and right now because he's mentioning this thought to himself and gaining positive reinforcement from himself. A solitary act can garnish a positive reinforcement effect. Again, I'm telling you this is the key to fully understanding the human mind in discrete form. We're built to think this way, and this is how we reconcile all of the endeavors that we have because we seek this particular emotional effect at the end of these processes. We want to tell someone we did this, or we have this, or we are this, and gain a positive response. This is the cause of our intelligent behavior. We're teased into existence by this particular emotional effect and mostly live by it until our dying day. Be sure to tune in for the next episode where we look at how positive reinforcement shapes a conscience. The girl at the counter, I hope she's working. Wondering if the wife is going to visit her brother today. She could maybe bring back the grill that was borrowed. Oh, turn the radio on. The subject has a fleeting image of the girl at the counter and then he thinks nothing further of it. He's apparently in just a partly automatic mode of admiring someone in a social way. If he were to have further thoughts on it, then it would certainly be in the realm of a bad idea, but he moves on to thinking of a task related to his wife. Then a song moves from the secondary thread to the first, and then he falls upon a reasoning step of turning on the radio. Skip that song. I wonder if I turn the coffee maker off. Yeah, because I also put the dishes away. Darn! Here a second thread of thought moves up to the first position and takes over. He abandons all his other thoughts and all the remaining secondary threads of thought calm down. There's no fleeting images and he's not putting attention to any kind of a music. He's soaking up all the stimulus of this possible dangerous event. Luckily, he then avoids the accident. This fills his thoughts for a while, but essentially he settles back down into his ongoing schedule. And this is an example of rolling through thoughts and passing through the different kinds of threads of thought to solve the life-form problems of consumption, reproduction, and peripheral. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.